Chapter 3. You're being dramatic, Ernest. It was 2 hours until closing time, yet Ernest wasn't the slightest bit tired. He was short one of his serving girls. Sarah had come down with a fever the day before, so the owner was working twice as much as usual, but his spirits were still high. With the 200 rupee from the night burning in his pocket, Ernest wondered if he'd even be able to sleep tonight. For what must have been the 20th time, the burly man glanced over to the table where the knight and his green-bearded friend sat. Sir Brutus had gotten excited about something a few moments ago, but now the two were sitting quietly without saying a word. Ernest thought it was very odd. Deem, the 250-pound bouncer, walked over to the counter and rested his elbow on the surface. "What you make of those two?" Ernest's nephew and employee asked. The bartender shrugged, swapped his clean glass for a dirty one, then said, "They're knights. Old friends from what Sir Brutus says." Deem shook his head. "I don't think the green one's a knight." He reached up and rubbed his stubbly chin with a hand. "Knights ain't allowed to have such unkempt beards." Ernest snorted. "Boy, what do you know about knights and their kempt beards?" Deem shrugged. "When I squired for Sir Nicholas, he used to whip me if I didn't shave. Said no respectable knight walks round with a beard, let alone stubble." The boy had a point. Ernest knew his nephew had indeed been a squire for 4 years. If only he hadn't been such a late bloomer, one of his masters might have kept him on to eventually become a knight. When his last master had released him, Ernest was sure the boy was going to break down in tears. That had been 13 years ago, when Deem was a scrawny 15-year-old lad. Now the 6'4" giant was a force to be reckoned with. Disgruntled by his failure to become a knight, the boy had joined the militia as a simple soldier. When that proved too boring for the boy with lofty dreams, Ernest had heard from his sister that the boy was traveling north to Absistus to work as a mercenary. When Deem finally came back home, he had a small fortune, a pregnant foreign wife, and an entirely new physique. Whatever he had done up north, it had been more than enough excitement for the lad. He purchased some land on the eastern edge of Farron Woods, built himself a cottage, then asked his dear old uncle for a job at the Cross Guard. Every now and then, when the liquor was flowing and his wife and child were home in bed, Deem would tell one of his stories about the work he and his crew had done. For the boy's sake, Ernest hoped the stories were exaggerated. "Do you think you could take 'em?" Ernest asked, eyeing his nephew's broad shoulders. A two-handed sword was visible behind one of those mountains. Years ago, the blade had had its use, but now it was mostly used to discourage rowdy patrons. Even then, the cudgel hanging from Deem's side had that work covered. The bouncer twisted his mouth to the side. "If they were regular Hyrulean knights, sure, maybe." He furrowed his brow. "But I don't think they're regular knights." "How's that? I mean, beside the green one's beard." Deem turned his head and looked his uncle square in the eyes. In a low voice, he said, "That one with the black hair, Sir Brutus, he's got the eyes of a killer." Ernest glanced, suddenly nervous, at the two men who were now speaking again. He was too far to see the generous knight's eyes. Had he seen a killer's eyes? Surely Sir Brutus had been nothing but kind to Tomi, Richard, and Sakon. Sensing his uncle's doubt, Deem continued, "Tell me, Uncle Ernie, when you have a drink with your pal Matt, do you set your dagger on the table between you two? Do you hold eye contact during your entire visit?" The owner's bushy eyebrows huddled over his head as he frowned. "What do you think they're doing then?" In an even lower voice, "I don't think that Link fella was expecting Sir Brutus," Deem said. "I think your friend Tomi just helped a hunter snare his prey." "And the murder of Queen Zelda." Deem, Ernest, and several patrons turned their attention to the knight and his strange outburst. The bouncer shot one last wary look at his boss, then stood up and headed over to his original spot by the entrance. Ernest shuffled over a few feet and glanced under his counter. His crossbow was still there. All it needed was to be cranked back and loaded with one of the bolts resting next to it. "Ah," he said to himself, "you're being dramatic, Ernest." Or so he hoped. Link winced as the words escaped his friend's mouth a little too loudly. He needn't even look around to know that more than a few heads had turned their way. He allowed 5 seconds to pass before deciding not to draw his sword from its sheath. Marcus Brutus seemed unperturbed by the curious looks. His face was emotionless, and his dark eyes bore into the sacrilegious, murderous thief who shared his table. Behind the bearded outlaw's head, in the knight's peripherals, he could see the bouncer, who'd been having a hushed discussion with the owner, moving away from the counter back towards his post, where his gaze would likely be lingering for longer intervals on the duo. Easily the second most dangerous man in the bar, third if Marcus included himself. "I was leagues away when the queen killed herself," Link said quietly. His voice was even, but his eyes were sad. Marcus pushed his now empty glass forward so that it slid halfway between he and Link. "It is no secret that she killed herself because of you." His voice was stern but not angry, not as passionate as one would expect from a devout servant and knight. His emotions, if he had any honest ones, were well kept. "Impa wrote me months before the Queen's end. She wrote that Queen Zelda had become ill and was becoming delirious." "She was smitten," Marcus interrupted. "Even during her marriage to King Yusuf, her handmaidens say she waited on the balcony for you." Marcus dropped his hands onto his hips, far too close to the hilts of his sword and dagger. "She named her daughter Navi, despite His Highness's protests. Had the child been born a boy, he would no doubt have been named Link." Anger was beginning to rear its head within Link's chest. "I had not had any contact with Queen Zelda since I left Hyrule 20 years ago." Marcus brought his hands back up, weaponless, and planted his palms flat on the table. "So this sheds light on your second crime, no? Only 8 people could truthfully recall your adventures in the future. King Yusuf had little doubt that you and the Queen partook in an unholy affair whilst you gallivanted through time." "Control yourself, Link." "Did any of the 8 confirm your king's suspicions?" Link placed his own hands back on the table. His right hand was touching the condensation of his almost empty glass, while his left hand rested 5¼ inches away from the pommel of his sword. The corner of the knight's mouth twitched. "Not a one. The king had Impa and Master Rauru executed for treason." "I cannot imagine Impa accepting such a sentence well." His voice was starting to lose its neutral tone. Marcus blinked. "I was ordered to carry out the Sheikah's sentence. There was little acceptance involved." "Control yourself, Link." "Your king is a tyrant," Link growled. "Better a tyrant who commands than a saint who cowers." The knight's friendly demeanor and voice had vanished. His relaxed posture had been replaced with that of a serpent, coiled, ready to strike. The end was coming. For one of them. "So, how does it start, Sir Brutus the Demon Slayer?" Link wished in that moment that he could spew venom instead of just words. Impa's murderer took in a long breath. "As soon as I confirm that you are carrying the royal family's relic, I will draw my longsword and lash out at you," he stated. Link didn't move. "I can only assume your honed reflexes will save you." His eyelids dropped over his shark eyes quickly, then retreated to their home under the brow. "But the gentleman to your left will not be so fortunate." A sharp inhale from Link. There were too many people in the tavern, and Marcus was too dangerous to try and save everyone. Innocents would die. Link brought his glass to his mouth, downed the last of his alcohol, then set the glass on the table directly in front of him. Free of the glass, his right hand reached inside his tunic, grabbed his most prized possession, then brought it out into the candlelit tavern for the Demon Slayer to see. Zelda's ocarina. He put it back without a word, clamped his jaw tight, and looked at Marcus expectantly. "Well," Marcus said without moving, "shall we begin?" Tomy stumbled outside the tavern, nearly falling towards the spinning earth. "Come on, Sir," he slurred to nobody in particular. "Let me show you how you can sleep with my wife." He guffawed at his own joke and almost fell face down into the earth again. He looked around, trying to gather his bearings. He was sure he could figure out his way home if only everything would hold still a moment. He could see several wide-eyed folks staring at him from the doorways. "Oh, just stand there, help'll tow me up." One of the folks whinnied at him. "Oh," he said, beginning to grasp how truly intoxicated he was. "You're all just horses." He blinked several times, trying to clear his vision. No, he had been right. There was a person there. They were feeding something shiny to a red horse.
I'll give you oats for your pony.
Tommy wasn't sure why he was sharing that. Maybe that Sir Brutus had just put him in a helpful mood. A shrill cry came from the red horse as the stranger forced the shiny object into its mouth. Tommy shook his clouded head, then gasped. The shiny object had been a short sword that was thrust through the red mare's neck. As the figure withdrew his blade, the horse collapsed against the stall door.
What? What did you do that for?
Tommy asked, backpedaling in a panic. He slipped on the uneven, wobbling earth and fell to his butt. The stranger flashed a demonic smile, then stepped forward so he was standing over the drunken fool.
Sir Brutus!
He cried over his shoulder.
Ernie!
To be continued.